Eruvin 91.
Sadia with Bays on the bottom. Sadia with Bays on the bottom, was it?
Correct. Sadik on the base on the bottom but mainly we're going to be doing 91 Sadik on. That's just for the tape. Let me move away from the mirror 1 second so you have a better vision.
Yeah. Okay.
Amar of Yehuda. Kishitim Saloimar. So remember, we had a three-way machlokes in the Mishnah regarding roofs, chatzeros, and karfefios. According to Rav Meir, if a kli started off on a roof, and let's say there were hundreds of roofs in the town. Now, below every roof is a different house owned by different people. Now, we know you cannot carry from one house to another house without an eruv because of the gzeira that the Chachamim made, that even though you normally midaraisa, you can go from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaYachid, but they said if it's owned by multiple people, it looks too much like going from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim. So they made a gzeira that you can go from Rishus HaYachid into a chotzer owned by multiple people, or you can go from one house to another house only if there's an eruv. However, our Mishnah said though, if you have roofs that are connected, even though the people downstairs have different owners, it's considered one rishus, and you can carry from one gag to another gag. That was the sheet of Rav Meir. The Rav Meir said though, if one gag was 10 tfachim higher than another gag, you couldn't, because it's a gzeira that you might put something from a Rishus HaRabim onto a tail, onto a mound 10 tfachim high. So if the roofs are not shaveh, if they're not even, Rav Meir did not allow you to go from roof to roof. But otherwise, if they were even, he allowed you to go from roof to roof. The Chachamim argued, and the Chachamim said that no, you can't go from roof to roof. Just like the Rishuyas are chalukos lamata, they're chalukas lamala. And then Rav Shimon said in our Mishnah that a gag, a chotzer, and a karfeif, it's all one rishus. And you can go from one to the other also without an eruv. That was the three-way machlokas tanoim from our Mishnah. And there were different ways of understanding that machlokas. It was Rav's. And now we're going to hear Rav Yehuda's understanding. Kishitim saloim aladiv Rav Meir. So Rav Yehuda is going to teach us another din in Rav Meir, the way he understands it. That gagin rishus la'atzmon, chatzeros rishus la'atzmon, and karfefius rishus la'atzmon. That all roofs are one rishus, and you can go from roof to roof to roof, but you cannot go from a roof to a chotzer, or from a chotzer, and you can go from chotzer to chotzer, and you can go from karfef to karfef, but you can't go from gag to chotzer, chotzer to karfef, karfef to gag. Those are all independent. Like Rashi says, Metat lemigago shel Ruven legago shel Shimon, and chatzeros shel Shlomo. Metat lemechatzer shel Ruven lechatzer shel Shimon. As long as kalim sheshafsu b'chotzer, as long as the kli started out in the chotzer, not in the house. Because remember, there's no eruv here. So without an eruv, we're concerned if the kli starts in the house, the person's going to take a kli from the house to the chotzer, and then that kli will go from a chotzer to a chotzer. So that's violating our rule. But a kli that started off Shabbos in the chotzer can go from chotzer to chotzer. And the karfefius rishus la'atzmon, says Rashi, afil ein shel shnei anoshim, same thing. We're talking about a karfef that's less than 5,000 square amas. Because remember, if a karfef is more than 5,000 square amas, it's considered a karmelis. So let's just read Rashi. We'll see clearly where Rav Yehuda is going. Da'am Rav Meir kol gagos ha'ir rishus achas, shma mina desfira le de'ein rishus mischalkos machmas shinu bailim. Like we say, the gag being a reshus on its own, we don't care that it's owned by different people. Ela batim lechudayu. The gzeira that you can't go from bias to bias without an eruv is special because of bias. Mipnei shehem tadiros ledira. But people live in a dira, so their private ownership. So what trumps? Multiple ownership or the fact that it's considered one type of reshus? So we see, according to Rav Meir, being one type of reshus trumps, pardon my, but it trumps the fact that it's owned by different people. The mali gaginu mali chatzeros mali karfefios. Aval migag lechotzer umigag lekarfef Rav Meir lo. But Rav Meir does not allow you to go from a gag to a chotzer or from a chotzer to a karfef. Vafilu shalish echad. Forget about multiple people. Let's say I own a bias, a chotzer, a gag, and a karfef, different locations. I can't. That means the different domains, even if it's on. You see, he looks more at, is it one domain much more important than whether it's owned by different people. Here he says the different domains, even if it's owned by one person, I can't go from a bias to a chotzer, or a chotzer to a gag, or a gag to a karfef. Vafilu shalechad, vafilu shalish echad, kiraminon, gzeira mishum tel b'shus harabim. Right? He already said I can't go from a roof to a roof 10 tvachim higher than it because of this tel b'shus harabim. Certainly, I can't go from a gag to a chotzer. Right? Certainly, if these things are owned by multiple people, not by one person, I can't go. I can't travel. I can't take something from chotzer lekarfef. The shaminu l'rabbanon l'kaman b'raisa to also l'tata mechotzer lekarfef. V'ravreya lo shaminu le'depol legalayu. We don't see Rav Meir argues with that concept that the Chachamim said that I can't carry from a chotzer to a karfef. Lahakel. El b'chilik reshuyas to gagin. The only time Rav Meir gives us a permission to go from a gag to a gag is when different owners own the gag. Hoil ushman shaveh, because the name gag is the same. Aval b'reshuyos achalukos b'shmon, but reshuyos that are different in their name. For example, gag has a different name than chotzer. Chotzer has a different name than karfef. Lo shamin and leide mekel. We don't see the Rav Meir's mekel. The dafka kom Rav Meir gagos the shashmish and shaveh. Rav Meir only allowed you to go from gag to gag to gag because its use is the same. And he allows you to go from chotzer to chotzer to chotzer because chatzeros are the same. Even if they're owned by multiple people. So as I said before, Rav Meir seems to focus more on the fact that it's the same reshuyos you're allowed to carry from one to one, even if they're owned to multiple people. It's not, we're not answering because it's owned by different people. The only time we said that is a batim Rav Meir and gagin l'rabbanon, right? The Rabbanon added, like I said in my introduction tonight, that just like the batim are mischalkos by different owners, according to Chachamim, I can't go from one to one. The roofs as well, even though the roof tashmish is the same, a gag is a gag is a gag, since they're owned by different people below, it's considered that they're owned by different people above. And the Rabbanon argue with Rav Meir and not allow you to go from gag to gag. Aval b'chiluk tashmish, v'shinu shem hareshus kapir, right? They also they certainly also make a difference between if the use is different, like a gag versus a chotzer versus a karfef, and a different shame. Hilkach, a chotzer lekarfef aser according to Chachamim. Vafilu hu shelo, even if it belongs to one person. Ve'eno yoser based sign, as long as it's not greater than 5,000 square amas. Like I said, because greater than 5,000 square amas is considered a karmas. Dal korcha hanach karfef is b'she'en yisrael based sign ko'amar. The Ibi Serim, if it's more than 5,000 square amas, Ba'alim Rav Shimon metaltalin, Rav Shimon also doesn't allow you that you can carry there because it's a karmelis. Ha-karmelisi, v'lekaman de palig. There is nobody who argues by a karmelis to mechotzra mishkan gami because we learn the din of karmelis from chotzra mishkan. Okay, so that's a very good Rashi that explains the nafkamina between Rav Meir and the Chachamim. Now, back to the Gemara. The Divrei Chachamim, Gagin v'chatzeros rishus achas. That Gag and Chotzer, they don't hold of this gzeira of Rav Meir that because one roof is higher 10 tefachim, we have a gzera because of tel b'shus harabim. They don't hold that. So according to Chachamim, you can carry from a gag to a chotzer. But karfefios is rishus achasein. But you can't go from a gag to a karfef or from a chotzer to a karfef. Now, l'divrei Rab Shimon kulan rishus achasein. According to Rav Shimon, you can go from a gag to a karfef, from a karfef to a chotzer. They're all considered one rishus. Tanya kavosei de Rav, Tanya kavosei de Rav Meir. I'm going to bring you a baraisa to support the way Rav explained and the way, in terms of, there was a machlokes, Rav and Shmuel, how to explain the Chachamim. We'll see what that is. And there's a baraisa that supports the way Rav Yehuda just explained it. Tanya kavosei de Rav. Kol gagus sa'ir, rishus achasein. If you have a city with 100 houses and they're all connected and they're all roofs, so according to Rav Meir, because this is the sheet of Rav Meir, all gags are one rishus. Because of this gzeira of tel b'rishus harabim, anything that's higher than 10 tefachim, you can't go from a chotzer to a gag or a chotzer. This is clearly Rav Meir. And kelim sheshavsu b'chotzer, mutar l'tatan b'chotzer. Kelim that started off on Shabbos, you can move them from chotzer to chotzer, even if they're owned by multiple people, and certainly if they're owned by one person. Begagin mutar l'tatlan begagin. And if the kli started off on the roof when Shabbos started, you can go from roof to roof to roof. As long as one roof was not higher or lower than the other one by 10 tefachim because of this gzeira tel b'shus harabim. So that's the Chachamim oimrim kol echad ve'echad rishus la'atzmon, that a gag and a karfeif and a chotzer are all their own rishus. So you notice this is like Rav, not like Rav Yehuda. We just quoted Rav Yehuda to say that for Chachamim, gagim and chatzerus are rishus achas. You can go from a gag to a chotzer and vice versa. So this price is clearly like Rav. That's why it says tiny kavosei de Rav. This is the point where we see the distinction. Because Chacham, in this price, it says, Kol echad ve'echad rishus la'atzmon. Gag, karfeif, and chotzer, you can't go from one to the other. And ve'ein metatlan bo'ala ba'arba. And you can only go arba amos. And remember Rav said, there was a machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Rav said that on a gag, you can't go more than 4 amos. The reason why is because he held, since you didn't make an eruv, you can't go from gag to gag, and each gag is openly to all the other roofs. It prevents you from going even more than 4 amos. Shmuel said no. Remember, Shmuel said you can carry as much as you want on an individual roof. But anyways, this is the baraisa to support, at least in this machlokas we're dealing with. Can you go from a gag to chotzer? This baraisa supports Rav that says you can't. However, Tanya kavosei Rav Yehuda. There's a baraisa to support Rav Yehuda. Amar Rebbe, kishayinu lomdim Torah etzel Rab Shimon b'Tkoya. And by the way, we're talking about Rab Shimon Bar Yochai here, right? And Rab Shimon lived in Tekoa, which is in the Galil, more to the north of Yam Kinneret. So when we were learning Torah about Rab Shimon, hayinu malin shemen v'aluntis migag legag, umigag lechotzer, mechotzer lechotzer, mechotzer lekarfif, mekarfif lekarfir acher, ad shayinu magim etzel hamayan shayinu rochtzim bo. So they used to bathe in the river on Shabbos in cold water, and they would take towels from a roof to from a chotzer to a karfeif until they got to the river. At the time of the Gemara, they were allowed to bathe in cold water, and in Chamei Tveria, that means in a natural hot spring, you could also bathe if you didn't heat up the water. I just want to read Shulchan Aruch Shin Chavav, Dinei Rechitza b'Shabbos. The Shulchan Aruch says, "Asur lirchotz kol gufa afilu kol lever ve'ever levad afilu b'mayim shehuchmu me'erev Shabbos You can't wash with water, hot water, even with water heated up Erev Shabbos. Bein imhein bekli, bein imhein bekarka, afilu shpoch hamayim gufu shtatef aser. Aval muter lechotz ben panav yadav v'raglav. You can wash your face and hands. However, the Shulchan Aruch says hani mila b'chamei ha'ur. That's in water that was heated up, by an oven, by a kli. Aval b'chamei Tveria muter lirchotz afilu kol gufo yachad. You could go into Chamei Tveria, and ve'ein tzarich lomer b'tzonanim. You could also bathe in a cold water river. Says the Mishnah Brura, b'tzonanim. Ayin l'kamei Mishnah Brura sif cotton chaf aleph shenoagu shelo lirchotz banar even b'tzonanim. And I'm looking at acharoichetz banar koitz min hapoiskim denoagu shelo lirchotz klal banar or b'mikvah. Our minig is not to go into the bath at all, even in cold water. Why? Motzri lovely they schita say, are you going to come to squeeze out your hair? It's a gzeira. The od kamatanim ayin b'mogen avram. Uli inyan tefila ayin lekame. For mikvah you can. For those that do mikvah, okay. But we see clearly in the time of the Gemara that there was a minig that they could bathe, but they wanted to bring towels. So how did they bring towels? Because according to Rab Shimon, you can go from a chotzer to a gag, and from a gag to a karfef, and the river wasn't a karfef. On Rav Yehuda Ma'aser b'shas sakana, Rav Yehuda gives another story that the Romans decreed that you can't learn Torah. They would bring a Sefer Torah through this mechanism. Again, it seems to be a raya that Reb Shimon holds that you can go from a gag to a karfet, like the Bryce, like we learned in Rav Yehuda, that kulan rushus achasein. According to Reb Shimon, in contradistinction to both Rav Meir and the Chachamim, you can carry from a gag to a chotzer and from a chotzer to a karfet. And Rav Yehuda wanted to bring it from this case. Chachamim answered, Amar lo, ain't shasa sakana raya. Shasa sakana, you could bring me a raya for shasa sakana, that's why. But in normal times, we wouldn't be allowed to do it. Okay. Reb Shimon Oimer, echad gagin, right? The Mishnah said that a gag and a chotzer and a karfet were all considered one rishus. Amar Rav halachic Reb Shimon. In fact, that's the halacha. We can carry from chotzers to gag and gag to karfets. And we'll see this, there's going to be a machlokes, whether that halacha applies only when they didn't make any eruv between the chatzeros. We paskin that it's afilu kishi irvu b'nei achotzer. Amar Rav, halach Rab Shimon. However, hu shelo irvu. When Rav says the halach is like Rab Shimon that I can go from a gag to a chotzer and to a karfev, that's only if the people, remember, you have multiple houses that open up into a chotzer. In order for people to carry into that chotzer, they need to make an eruv. So Rav says the halachas Reb Shimon only if the people in the chotzers did not make an eruv. Aval irvu lo. But if they made an eruv, so therefore people in that chotzer are allowed to carry their kelim from the bayis into the chotzer. So we don't allow you to go from chotzer to chotzer and from a chotzer to gag and all these other places because we're worried that people's stuff that started off in Shabbos in the house is going to end up moving outside of that chotzer. The gazrin and dil masila fukeman the batim lechatzer. However, Shmuel Amar, we're not worried about that. Bein irvu, bein shelo irvu. This halach of Rav, that he said that halach is like Rab Shimon, that I can go from a gag to a chatzar, from a chatzar to a karfet. That's whether I made an eruv. That means whether the people in the chatzar made an eruv or whether they didn't. Rav Yochanan mi lachshach bein irvu and shelo irvu. Who told you that it makes a difference between an eruv? It makes no difference. The Gemara now is going to spend a bit of time trying to hack on this notion that it's mutter to go from gag to a chatzar to a karfet, even if they didn't make an eruv. Whether they made an eruv, whether they didn't make an eruv. Remember, it's worse if they made an eruv.
Why is it worse?
We said because if you made an eruv, you can carry. Without an eruv, the people can't carry from a kli from their house into the chutzner. You have 3 houses that open up into a chutzner. The chutzner is owned by 3 different people. We know there's a concept. Chazal saw that even though chutzner is rishus hayachid, the bayis is rishus hayachid, they made a gzeira. I can't go from my house into that chutz. If I live in an apartment house, I'm not allowed to go into the joint areas because everyone owns things there. So we have to buy a loaf of bread, put it in one place, all becomes one rishus, and then I can do it. So they're worried if I'm allowed to go from chutzer to gag to chutzer, even when I make an eruv, something that ends up in my house is going to end up going from this chutzer to a gag to a karfet. That we're not allowed to do. This din that Rav Yehuda said that Rav Shimon says kulan rishus achas, it's only for kli that's shavas b'chotzer, that started off either in a chotzer or a gag or a karfet. One of those rishus outside of the bias. Even Rav Shimon is moided that something that starts in the house cannot go from chotzer to gag to karfet. Only kalim that started up. So that's why it's worse if you made an eruv. If you didn't make an eruv, they can't carry anything from their house into the chotzer. So l'chula alma shelo irvu. Rab says the halach is like Rav Shimon, and you can go from a gag to a chotzer and from a chotzer to a karfet. But Shmuel and Rav Yochanan say it makes no difference whether the people in the chotzer made an eruv or they didn't make an eruv. I can still do it. We don't have to worry about that. Maskiv Rav Chizda, l'Shmuel Rav Yochanan. According to Rav Shmuel, Rav Yochanan said it makes no difference even she'irvu yoimru shnei chelim b'chotzer achaz zem muter v'zeh. It's going to come to a problem. People are going to see kalim, a barrel or anything in the chotzer. One item is going to be permitted to go from chotzer to chotzer, and one item is not, because perhaps somebody did carry something from the bias into the chotzer on Shabbos, and it's going to move, even though they didn't make an eruv. So how are you going to make a distinction? So Rab Shimon l'tamei deloy gazar. Rab Shimon is consistent because he didn't make the following zera. This on Rab Shimon, this worry that you're going to have two kalim and you're not going to know which kli started where, we don't have to worry about it. I'll prove it to you from a following case. L'shalosh chatzeros hapsucha zulazu. Psucha zulazu. This is a case we had before. 3 side-by-side chatzeros. They open up into each other. And the chatzeros open up to Rishus HaRabbi. The irvu shtei chitzonos imayim tzois. You have A, B, and C. A and C made an eruv with B. He muteres imahen. B can carry things into A and C. Vehein muteres ima. A and C can carry things into B. But A and C can't have anything to do with each other. Right? Shtei chitzonos asurim zu im zu. Now there as well, if A and C can move their personal kalim into B, why aren't we worried? Oh, well, we're not going to know which kli it is. Maybe they're going to end up transferring things, and kalim and B are going to end up in A or in C, which started off in the opposite place. So you see, clearly he allows it. He's not geyser. And you see, he was not geyser. We shouldn't allow this because a kli that was in A is going to end up in C, or a kli that started off in C is going to end up in A. So Hanami, in our case as well, by the Gagim and the Chatzeros, even if the people make an eruv, and somebody from a bias is permitted to bring their kli into there, but they're not allowed to, once that kli gets into the Chotzer on Shabbos, you can't move that from Chotzer to Chotzer to the Gag, but there are kalim that started off in the Chotzer when Shabbos started, which you are allowed. We're not worried that you're going to make a mistake by kalim. Hanami, lo gazrina dil masi lafuke mani the batim lechotzer. So the first attempt to ask a kasha was deflected. Mostly Rav Sheshes tried another. Rav Shimon Oimer, they quote our Mishnah, Echad Gagois, Echad Chatzeros, Ve'echad Karfefios, Rishus Achasen Lekelim Sheshavsu B'Sochan. Right? You can go from a Gag to a Chatzer to a Karfef as long as the Kli started off in Shabbos in one of those, either in the Gag or the Chotzer or the Karfef. However, the Lola Kalim Sheshavsu B'Sochabayis. But it's not permitted to go, if the Kli started off on Shabbos in the house, and then you moved it into the Chotzer, that Kli cannot go from Chotzer to Gag and Gag to Karfef, etc. Now, you can see where the Gemara is going. How did the Kli end up in the Chotzer? in this hypothetical, where it says the lola kalim sheshafsu b'soch habayis. Well, that means a kli ended up in the chutzner that started off in the shop that started off by Shabbos in the house. Now, how did it end up in the chutzner? So if they made an eruv, so they made an eruv. That's how you could legally take a kli from a bayis into a chutzner. But if you're telling me that they didn't make it, because remember, Rav Shmuel and Rav Yochanan say bein irvu, bein shelo irvu. But if shelo irvu, how would you ever have a kli in the chutzner that started off in the house? You're not allowed to move from a bayis to a chutzner if there's no eruv. Even in your own chutzner, if it's owned by multiple people. Yeah, if it's only one, we're not talking about a bayis with its own chutzner. When we use the word chutzner, the standard construct in Chazal were multiple homes opening up in the chutzner. In a chanami, you have a bayis of your own chutzner, there is no problem taking a kli. That's why we can take our kalim into our own backyard. Our backyard is a personal chutzner. It's not owned by multiple people. But if you live in an apartment house and multiple people own homes, and then they all have permission to eat that chutzner, that meets the requirement that you need an eruv to go from your house into a chutzner. Because that gzeira that it looks like Rabim is only when Rabim own it. If it's one bias and one chutzner, there's no need for an eruv. But here, the standard chutzner that they're talking about is always multiple homes. You see the kasha. So who moisif lavu mufarikla? He himself, Rav Sheshes, asked the question and he answered. Who moisif lavu mufarikla? No, but because remember, Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel said, "Bein irvu, bein shelo irvu," that the halacha is like Rav Shimon. Well, fine, I understand the case of irvu. That's why the Baraisa makes sense that we quoted. That's how a kli ended. That's because the Baraisa says the lola kalim sheshafsu b'soch habayis. Well, a kli that starts from the bayis, how did it end up in the chutzner that you're worried that you cannot take such a kli from a chutzner to a gag to a karfei? Well, if you made an eruv, you can move something from a house to the chutzner. But if shelo irvu, how do you explain the baraisa? Our answer is b'chusudra. He was wearing a kerchief. So if you're wearing something, you're allowed to walk outside your house into the chutzner with a kerchief, and you happen to take your kerchief off, and you rested it in the chutzner. That's a legal way that something ended up in the chutzner that started off on Shabbos in the bayis. Toshma Tzadik Aleph Amud Beis. Toshma.
How does he call that a keli? A scarf?
Item
Nothing.
is,
It's a keli is a general terminology then.
no. Mana includes begadim. Begadim are also manas. A mana at kli in halachic literature is also a beged. A beged is a kli. Absolutely. That's right, sir. How did something end up into the chutzner? Yeah, that's actually a very good akimta.
So he can wear it out too then. Can he wear it out?
And a sudar is a turban or a kerchief or something. What was that?
So he can wear it out.
As soon as usually a turban, by the way.
Malbush you can wear. When I wear clothing, I walk outside with just a rabbim. That's not a problem. It's not carrying, but it's still a kli. So that's when it says kalim sheshavsu that started off in the house on Shabbos is referring to a malbush.
So he wears it out.
You're not to take it off. No, let's say I walked out into the chutzner, I take my malbush off and I put it down. I haven't done anything wrong. Toshma. Anshe chutzner. By the way, tomorrow I assume we're learning at 9:00 in the morning. Is that okay with everybody?
All right.
Walter, okay with you?
Yeah. Me, I don't know. We'll see. I'll try.
Okay. Well, I mean, we don't have anything else planned tomorrow morning. Correct?
Okay.
Toshma. Anshe chotzer v'anshe mirpeses. Rashi says, Diure aliyas harbe psuchna. We have like a second story. Second story, people live there. They have their own chotzer. And they have their own stairway that leads to a chotzer in front of, right? There's a bias with an aliyah. And the upstairs has their own stairway that goes down to the chotzer. That was a construct that we had before. Anshe chotzer v'anshe mirpeses. Now, each one of them they didn't make an eruv b'nei chotzer and b'nei mirpeses. Arval irvu elu l'malon ve'elu l'malon le'atzma. So again, upstairs, it's multiple batim opening up into a chotzer upstairs. And they have their own access way out to a chotzer downstairs. And then downstairs is multiple houses that open up in the chotzer in front of there. Now, in order for those people to carry from their house into the chotzer, they need to make an eruv among themselves. Upstairs, people also have to make an eruv among themselves because they open up into a chotzer, which now has multiple diurin accessing that chotzer. So, of course, we know that to go from a bais to a chotzer in that fashion, you need an eruv. So each one made their own independent eruv, but they didn't make an eruv with each other. So they cannot go from downstairs to upstairs or upstairs to downstairs. Somebody's got noise going on. Yeah. Then if you have a post in the chotzer that is the outside, right? I don't have a drawing, but the balcony, the people upstairs go down a stairway into a chotzer, and in that chotzer is a post that's asar tfachim. And it will see that you have to be within arba tfachim of the mirpeset. The mirpeset, those people can use that post. Pachas mikan. Now, if it's less than asar tfachim, then it's not its own independent place. It's considered like part of the downstairs chotzer, and it can only be used by the downstairs chotzer. We're talking about the people upstairs were multiple people, the people downstairs were multiple people. The irvu elu liatzman ve'elu liatzman, and each made their own eruv. Or it could be a case where there's only one person living upstairs and one person living downstairs, where they don't have their own. They don't necessarily need to make their own eruv to go from a bais to a chutz, like we explained earlier. Now, if there were multiple people living in both places, when they did not make an eruv among themselves, not between upstairs and downstairs. I mean, even the downstairs people didn't make an eruv, or the upstairs people didn't make an eruv. So they're not allowed to take something from their bias to their own individual chotzer. So gag v'chotzer v'achzandra umir peses, a roof, a chotzer, a gazebo, and an upper area. Kulan rishusach said, I can carry an item that started off in the gag or the chotzer or the achzandra umir peses from each one of those different places. Now you notice here, the Gemara is saying that it's only when they didn't make an eruv, right? Yes, we've been learning tonight that Shmuel and Rav Yochanan say this concept of being able to from going to a gag to a chotzer to a mirpeses is bein she'irvu bein shelo irvu. But this baraisa seems to suggest that only works if they did not make an eruv. Taima deloy irvu among themselves. Ha irvu lo. So the Gemara says, so that's not a kasha. That's not Rab Shimon. Homani Rabbanani. You know what? Because it's the Rabbanon who normally don't allow you. Right? The moidu that begagin v'chatzeres rishusachas saying. They say that a gag and a chatzer are rishusachas, but the other ones are not rishus the same. So certainly, if they made an eruv, they wouldn't allow no matter what. And daikanami. The loktoni karfe fumavu. Notice this baraisa didn't mention karfe fumavu. Karfe fumavu is only going Rab Shimon. Shema know that we're talking about Rabbanon. Gemara is going to try another proof. Toshma Chomesh chatzeros apsucha zu lezu. You have 5 side-by-side chatzeros. They're open into each other, and they open up to a mavui, to a street, psuchos lamavui, which is a 3-way street, 3-walled street. And v'shachol kulam v'lo irvu. None of them made an eruv with each other. Osir la'achnis lotzim and chotzer lamavui. So you cannot take things that started off in the chotzer into the mavui. Umin ha'mavui l'chotzer, can't things that start off in the mavui, you can't move them in the chotzer. The kelim sheshavsu b'chotzer, kelim that start off Shabbos in the chotzer, mutar l'tatan b'chotzer, they can be carried in that chotzer. They can't go from chotzer to chotzer because there was no eruv. And uva mavui osir, kelim that start off in the mavui, you can't carry at all. Because a mavui, without chitus mavuos, without a lechi and a kor and everything, you can't carry there. But Rab Shimon matir, Shai Rab Shimon oimer kozman shehein shel rabim. If you have things that owned by multiple people, v'shach v'lo irvu, they didn't make an eruv. God, you notice he doesn't say bein irvu bein shelo irvu. He just says when they didn't make an eruv, then God chotzer achzaner and present karfef v'mavui kulam shesachasein. And the Gemara now jumps on this. Taima d'lo irvu. So this is our old friend Rab Shimon, and it's not like the way Rav Yochanan and Shmuel learned bein she'iru bein shelo irvu. It's only when you didn't make an eruv, ha irvu lo. And for the Gemara, my lo irvu chatzeros badi adodi. That means you had 5 chatzeros side by side. These chatzeros didn't make an eruv with themselves. Ha chatzer ubatim irvu. But remember, every chatzer has multiple houses opening into it. There they made an eruv. And yet you're allowed to go from Gag v'chotzer v'chzanim and Pesach Karfeif, even though the owners, the people in this chotzer and bias are allowed to take their kelim from their bias into the chotzer because they made an eruv among themselves. Frag the Gemara, how can you say irvu v'alo irvu ktani? So Gemara says, my lo irvu means lo nishtatfu. That means they didn't make a shitus mavuos, but an eruv chatzeros they made. V-boy Sam, if you want, you don't like that answer, I'll give you another answer. That it's not Rab Shimon at all. Rab Shimon l'divrayim d'rabbanan kamer lehu. Rab Shimon is dealing with the chachamim. Lididi, my shita that I can go from Gag to Chotzer to Achzandra to Mirpesas to Karfev, loishna irvu v'loishna lo irvu. Makes no difference whether that the people in the Chotzer and their batim are made an eruv among themselves or not. Ela lididchu, but according to your shita, at least at least admit to me, at least when they didn't make an eruv, it's still a rishus. I mean, the Rabbanan Losh they Rishu is saying they only accept Gag v'chotzer, but Alexandra and Pesach for Karfei for Mavu, they don't accept that like Reb Shimon. Stay Rishus and they're considered multiple Rishus. Omar Mar. So we mentioned something in passing. Uva Mavui Osir, that if a kli started out in the Mavui, you cannot do anything with that kli either. So Mesaila Rav Zera Amarav. This supports Rav Zera Amarav. Amar Zera Amarav. Mavi shlon yishtatfu bo. You have a mavui, multiple chatzeros opening up into that mavui. They didn't make a sheet of mavuos. Ein metalton el bar bamis. You can't carry in that mavui more than 4 amas. This seems to support what we just said, that b'mavui osir. So the Gemara answers no. Ema v'la mavui osir. It means you can't carry from a chotzer to the mavui. But in the mavui you can carry. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? Then hainu reisha. Then why is this different than the reisha? So the Gemara says, Mishnah Yisir Yitzchak, it's still a chiddush. Mao to say, Malkit li Rabban Aleid Rab Shimon. When the Chacham argued Rab Shimon Hanim Lecha di Irvu. That's when they made an Eruv. Aval Lecha de Lo Irvu, when there's no Eruv. Moidule, maybe they admit Kamash Malon that they don't admit. They still argue the Mavui is Usr, even when they didn't make an Eruv. You might think they didn't make an Eruv. We don't have to worry that things are going to end up in the Chotzer and the Mavui inappropriately. The Chachamim are machmer even in that situation. Okay, so we'll stop here, and we will pick up tomorrow at 9 o'clock. It's a small
9
break.
o'clock tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Can we say that the chutz on a gah is a mocha patur because it's It's more than 10 amas high?